Imagine this, a world where there were no retirement homes, no pensions, no take it easy phase of life, and yet people still found ways to live, enjoy, and even gain power as they grew older. Ancient Rome, one of the most powerful empires in history, filled with warriors, politicians, emperors. But what happened when those same people grew old? Did they become weak, forgotten, pushed aside? Or did they unlock a completely different kind of power? Because here's something most people don't realize. In Rome, getting older didn't always mean losing your place. Sometimes it meant finally becoming dangerous. Think about it. A young man had strength, speed, ambition. But an old man, he had experience, connections, secrets, and knowledge of how the system really worked. And in Rome, that kind of power could be more valuable than any sword. In fact, the entire political system of Rome was built around older men. The very word Senate comes from senex, meaning old man. Let that sink in. The people running one of the greatest empires in history were literally called the old men. And they weren't weak. They were the ones making decisions, controlling armies, shaping laws, and influencing emperors. So while young soldiers fought on the battlefield, old men controlled the outcome of wars from behind the scenes. Now imagine reaching old age in Rome. You've survived wars, politics, betrayals. You've seen how power rises and falls. At that point, you're no longer playing the game. You understand the game, and that's when life changes. Because old age in Rome wasn't about slowing down, it was about shifting roles. Many older Romans moved away from physical work and stepped into positions of influence. They became advisors, mentors, strategists. Young politicians would seek them out, not for strength, but for guidance. Because one piece of advice from the right person could decide your entire future. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Older Romans didn't just work. They knew how to enjoy life too. But not in the way you might expect. Their version of enjoyment was deeper, more refined, and often more powerful. Let's start with something simple. Social life. Rome was a city of gatherings, conversations, and influence. Older men would spend hours in public spaces discussing politics, philosophy, and strategy. These weren't just casual talks. These conversations shaped decisions, alliances, and sometimes even the fate of the empire. Because in Rome, a conversation could be more powerful than a weapon. And the older you were, the more your words carried weight. Now think about daily routines. Many older Romans followed structured, almost ritual-like lifestyles. They woke up early, handled personal affairs, met clients or followers, and then spent time in baths. Yes, the baths. This is where things get interesting. Public baths in Rome were not just for cleaning. They were centers of relaxation, networking, and even quiet power plays. Older men would go there daily. They would sit in warm pools, relax their bodies, and at the same time talk, exchange ideas, build alliances, influence others. It was like a silent battlefield where deals were made without anyone noticing. And this wasn't limited to men. Women in Rome, especially older women, had their own form of influence. They might not sit in the Senate, but they controlled something just as powerful, the household. And don't underestimate that. In Roman society, family was everything. Wealth, status, inheritance, all flowed through the family structure. Older women often became the central authority inside the home. They managed resources, guided younger generations, and influenced decisions from behind the scenes. A single word from a respected older woman could shape marriages, alliances, and financial decisions. And just like men, they also had ways of enjoying life. Social gatherings, religious festivals, visits to temples, and private events. Life didn't stop. It evolved. Now let's talk about something even more fascinating: freedom. Because for many Romans, old age brought a kind of freedom they never had before. When you're young, you're trying to prove yourself, climb ranks, gain recognition. But when you're older and you've already achieved status, you don't need approval anymore. You choose what you want. Some older Romans left the chaos of the city and moved to the countryside. Villas surrounded by nature, peaceful, controlled. Here they focused on simple pleasures: gardening, reading, writing, thinking. But don't mistake this for a quiet life. Even in these villas, influence continued. Letters were sent. Decisions were influenced. Networks were maintained. Distance didn't mean disconnection. It meant control without visibility. And that's a different kind of power. Now here's something that might surprise you. Entertainment. Rome was famous for its games, gladiators, theater, and yes, older people were part of it too. They attended events, watched performances, and stayed connected to the cultural life of the city. But their perspective was different. They weren't just watching. They were analyzing, understanding, sometimes even sponsoring these events, because controlling entertainment meant controlling public attention, and again, influence. Now let's connect this to something bigger. What did older Romans really do with their time? They didn't just pass time, they shaped the future. Through advice, through influence, through quiet decisions made behind closed doors. They became the hidden layer of society. The ones who didn't need to be seen, to be powerful. And here's where things start to feel familiar. Because if you look at modern Italy today, you'll notice something interesting. Family structures are still strong. Older members are still respected. They still play a role in decision making, especially within families. Long meals, deep conversations, social gatherings. These are not new. They are echoes of the past. The lifestyle may have changed, but the essence remains. Because some systems don't disappear, they evolve. So when you imagine old age in ancient Rome, don't picture weakness. Don't picture isolation. Picture influence, connection, freedom, and a different kind of enjoyment. One that comes not from chasing power, but from understanding it. And this is just the beginning. Because what older Romans did behind closed doors, how they spent their private time, and the hidden ways they truly enjoyed life, that's where things get even more unexpected. And this is where everything changes. Because what older Romans did in public was only half the story. The real life, the real enjoyment, the real power. It all happened behind closed doors, away from the noise of the streets, away from the crowds, away from the image they showed the world. Because in Rome, privacy was not just comfort, it was control. Imagine stepping inside a Roman villa owned by an older man or woman who had already made it in life. The outside might look calm, quiet, even simple. But inside, that's where influence, luxury, and strategy quietly existed together. These villas were not just homes. They were personal kingdoms. Gardens carefully designed, water flowing through fountains, statues placed with meaning, rooms built for conversation, not just living. Everything had a purpose. And the older you were, the more control you had over that space. Because by that stage of life, Romans weren't trying to impress everyone. They were choosing who mattered. Small, private gatherings became one of the biggest ways older Romans enjoyed life. Not loud parties, not chaos, but controlled environments. Only trusted people invited, only meaningful conversations allowed. These gatherings were where real discussions happened: politics, business, philosophy, secrets. A single evening in the right villa with the right people could shift alliances, create opportunities, or destroy reputations. And the most powerful person in that room, usually the oldest one, because they weren't speaking to prove something. They were speaking because they already knew. Now let's go deeper into something even more personal. Time. For younger Romans, time was always running out. They had to achieve, fight, prove themselves. But older Romans, they controlled their time. And that changes everything. They could spend hours reading scrolls, studying philosophy, reflecting on life. Not because they had nothing to do, but because they understood something most people never realize. Thinking is power. Many older Romans became deeply interested in philosophy, not just as knowledge, but as a way of living. Ideas about life, death, control, happiness. They explored these not as theories, but as realities they were getting closer to. And that gave them a different kind of calm, a different kind of enjoyment, not loud, not visible, but deep, and almost untouchable. Now here's something people rarely talk about: legacy. Because when you reach old age in Rome, you're not just living anymore. You're preparing what comes after you. And this became one of the most important activities for older Romans. They focused on their name, their family, their reputation, how they would be remembered. They wrote wills, arranged marriages, secured alliances. But more than that, they shaped the future. A decision made by an older Roman could affect generations. And they knew it. That awareness, that sense of impact, it gave their life a kind of meaning that most people never experience. Now let's talk about something more human: enjoyment in simple things. Because not all pleasure in Rome was about power. Some of it was about slowing down and actually feeling life. Food, for example, meals in older age became experiences. Not rushed, not careless. Carefully prepared, shared with the right people, enjoyed slowly. Long dinners, deep conversations, laughter, stories. This wasn't just eating. This was connection. And if you look at modern Italy today, you'll see the same thing. Meals are not just about food. They're about time, family, presence. That's not a coincidence. That's history continuing. Now think about daily routines again. Morning walks, time in gardens, observing nature. These might sound simple, but for someone who spent their youth in chaos, they were powerful, because peace becomes valuable only after you've lived through noise. And older Romans understood that better than anyone. Now let's touch something even deeper. Control over emotions. Younger people react. Older Romans, they observed. They had seen betrayal, loss, success, failure. Nothing surprised them anymore. And that gave them a kind of emotional strength. They didn't panic easily. They didn't chase every opportunity. They chose carefully. And that made them dangerous in a different way. Because when someone doesn't react, you can't control them. Now imagine this kind of person in a room full of ambitious young men. While others argue, compete, try to prove themselves, the older Roman sits quietly watching, understanding, waiting. And when he speaks, everyone listens. Because experience has a different weight. Now let's connect this to something you might not expect. Freedom from fear. When you're young, you fear failure. You fear judgment. You fear losing everything. But when you've already lived most of your life, what's left to fear? Older Romans often reached a point where fear lost its power. And that changes how you live. You become more honest, more direct, more real. And that alone can be a form of enjoyment. Because you're no longer pretending. You're simply being. Now here's the final twist. Were all older Romans living like this? No. Some struggled. Some lost wealth, lost influence, or were forgotten. But those who understood the system, those who built connections, knowledge, and reputation over time, they didn't just grow old. They evolved. They moved from visible power to invisible control, from chasing life to understanding it. And maybe that's the biggest lesson hidden in all of this. Old age in Rome wasn't the end. It was a transformation, from noise to silence, from action to strategy, from being seen to truly seeing. So the next time you think about ancient Rome, don't just imagine soldiers and emperors. Imagine the older figures, sitting quietly in villas, walking through gardens, speaking in low voices. Because in many ways, they weren't stepping away from life. They were finally experiencing it at its deepest level.